Hi, Alex. Good morning from me, and good evening over UK time to you.
Hi, Reed. Very nice to see you again.
Yeah, it's been a week and a
More than
half.
a week and a half, isn't it?
Exactly.
Since SQL Bits.
Um, yeah, I think it seems like our bodies are both recovering a little bit from the amount of travel and work we put in March.
Quite an intense month for events around the world, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I will say, as always, SQL Bits was a lot of fun, and costume party is still the thing to beat every year for the best conference party to attend.
Well, it wouldn't be anything without speakers from all around the world making the effort to come over. So thank you to you for being a part of it.
Absolutely, yeah. And the thing that I think is the second or third time that I've had you back on this stream. At least second.
The second, I think it is. Yeah, second.
Yeah. Yeah, it
We'll do a third at some
came
point.
up exactly. It came up in conversation, I think, just for the fact that I realized it was two and a half years ago was the last time, back when Sentinel was a lot younger and definitely didn't have nearly as many features. And Fabric didn't even exist back in the day.
That's right. Fabric wasn't even a glint in Microsoft's eye. It was purely Power BI, and yeah, it was a much smaller product. And obviously, as Power BI has expanded over the years, the capability of the tools expanded, and so the need to monitor it, manage it, and govern it has increased. So Sentinel's gone from strength to strength over the last couple of years. So yes, there's a lot more stuff in there now.
All we had really back then was data marts were around. Yeah, data marts came out like three and a half years ago, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, if you look at the core of Power BI, not much has really changed in terms of data sets are now called semantic models, but you've still got your workspace, you've still got your security, you've still got managing the health of it, and but as Microsoft have improved the API to Power BI, that's opened up a lot of extra capability for us to then hook into it and manage it and monitor it. And obviously now with Fabric coming on the scene, the whole Power BI infrastructure is transforming, and what was simply Power BI with semantic models and reports and a few data flows now is so much more. It's your entire data engineering, your warehouse, your data lake houses, machine
Yep.
learning workloads, Spark notebooks, all coming into your Power BI estate, and that suddenly transforms what was a, I'm not going to call it a simple reporting solution, but a relatively boxed, from what it could do capability. Suddenly, it's increasing tenfold in its capability. And one of the challenges we see with a lot of customers on the Purple Frog consultancy side of things is they don't really have a handle on managing the underlying Power BI estate as it is. And they're asking us to help them get involved with, okay, how can they start adopting Fabric? And that's quite scary, because if you don't really have a good handle on your existing Power BI infrastructure, suddenly expanding it with Fabric, it's just going to be building a great big house on top of a very solid, marshy foundations, and it's all going to come crumbling down if you're not careful. So a huge part of what we're doing with customers is helping them really plan and understand what should their Power BI estate look like, and what can they do to get control of that, to really prepare for bringing Fabric capability into it as well without losing control. And losing control of your data environment is no fun exercise, I'll tell you that.
I think I want to riff off of one of the comments that you made, and also just give you a chance before we have a fun deep dive into the whole conversation of administration governance within Power BI and Fabric. But you mentioned that the like if your Power BI is not well managed already, there's no magic wand that's going to fix problems that you had in Power BI by just moving to Fabric. That's actually one thing that I talked about in the session that I did with Kurt. At the Fabric conference, which we had like 740 people in that room. That was a lot of people. It was the most people I've ever presented in front of. And Kurt did all the content kind of in an in-person live stream format, which is what we were trying to go for. Like I'm the moderator, the riffer, and he did the content. But we had the bottom-up scenario of people who were kind of self-service business users, kind of self-taught Power BI, but they had problems with like slow DAX measures and all this, and they just thought there'd be like a magic wand waved with, oh, if we move everything into one lake and direct lake and all these performance problems will just be solved. But like, no, if you already have systemic problems in your Power BI environment, there's no just migration that will just fix everything. You have to fix it there first, and then you can leverage all the other features, the outer layers of the onion, if the inner layer is the semantic model.
Yeah, you couldn't be more spot on. And if there was a magic wand, the world would be a great, wonderful place. I'm sure at some point there will be a magic wand co-pilot that you can press the button and it will just fix everything. But
There's
that's
only
still
one magic wand, and that's the money wand, which is the well, if and yeah, so it's and I've seen a lot of customers like, well, we don't know how to fix it, so what can we do? Well, we can pay more money to increase our capacity, but nobody wants to do that. It's the poisoned apple magic wand. It technically does fix a problem, but it costs a lot of money to fix the problem, which people want to avoid. But tangents aside, like since it's been a few years, do you want to give a little introduction of yourself, kind of certainly your involvement in SQL Bits, but then well, and kind of leading into what we'll be talking about today?
Yeah, sure, great. So yes, I'm Alex Whittles. I've been a data platform MVP for I think it's 9 years now. I haven't got my 10-year disc, so I think it must be 9 years. And I founded Purple Frog Systems 17 years ago, which is a data analytics consultancy based in the UK, international client base, really focused on a center of excellence around data warehousing, data lakes, ETL, data analytics, machine learning within the Microsoft space, from on-prem SQL Server through to Synapse, Azure, and now obviously Fabric and Power BI. And one of the core challenges that we face with a number of our larger customers on that side of it is to help them manage and govern their Power BI estates. There was a lot of pushback on expanding their use of Power BI because of the lack of governance, transparency, auditing, and visibility about what's going on inside Power BI. So I created a second company, Power BI Sentinel, and we developed a software as a service solution that sits alongside Power BI that hooks into all the APIs, sucks out all the information, and gives you your own database, Azure SQL DB or Fabric now, Fabric data warehouse, full of all of the capability, all the information about what's inside your Power BI and Fabric estates, audit logs, security management, to really help you get a better feel for it. And that's where Sentinel came from. And we started that 5 years ago. And then in parallel with that, I've also been on the organising committee for SQL Bits for, I've lost count of how many years now. In fact, I started the year I got my MVP, so it'll be similar, 9 years. SQL Bits, the largest Microsoft data platform conference in Europe, similar to Past Summit in the US, for anyone that knows that. But it's purely organised by the community, for the community. And yeah, so we had that running 2 weeks ago in Farnborough, UK. And 2,500 people over 5 days, 14 parallel rooms, quite a lot to organise. There's 8 of us who run it in our spare time. So there's it's like running a third company. So yeah.
It's appreciated every year. You guys, and Europe does conferences better than the US. They are a lot less formal. I will say, and in business, they're like they focus on business topics, but it's just more, they're more laid back and fun. To a degree.
That's fair, but it's not necessarily down to the geography. I think it's more down to the ownership. So Past Summit, for example, now obviously it's owned and managed by Redgate, who are very, very community focused, always have been. But prior to COVID, it was managed by a profit-making organization who's had a very close tie-in. Microsoft were on the board, for example. It had to present a corporate face. And any large corporate, whether it be Microsoft or AWS or anyone, has to maintain that corporate look and feel. One of the benefits we have at SQL Bits is that we have no corporate ties whatsoever. We run it as a not-for-profit. None of us get paid for it. It's purely volunteer-led, for the community, by the community. And yes, we have Microsoft as sponsors. We have lots of sponsors, and they don't control what we can do in the events. They decide whether they want to be a part of it or not. And that gives us a huge amount of flexibility with having a little more fun about it than your standard average conference. We can give away beers and have a good party on a Friday night. We can do pub quizzes and the stuff that actually we find really helps the networking side of it. And the number of people and colleagues and friends that I know who have either met lifelong friends, got new careers, new jobs, we just learned a lot from those evening networking events, which are all within the main event center. They're not outside and separate. You don't have to have an invite to them. And we get the flexibility of doing that because we run it ourselves. We're not tied to corporate decision makers, and that makes it quite a bit more fun.
I think that's a fair point. The fact that most of the European conferences are community ran versus corporate ran in the US. So I think of yours, Next Step Data Mines, or at least anything in the data platform tech Microsoft space. They have sponsorships, but definitely nothing that's put on by like a large company to any degree.
Yeah, and then you look at things like Data Grillen in Germany, which is really just an excuse to have a really good barbecue and beers, and then learn something and meet some great people on the way. So
They give you a beer when you present, and if you run out of that beer, the tech will bring you another beer. I've only done it once, just because it's at a time where it's hard between other stuff. But I did have a lot of fun the first time I went pre-COVID when it was hosted by Ben and Will, and wearing a cooking apron and drinking a beer was very fun. That was the first time I had a beer on stage. Like, why don't all conferences do this? Like, I mean, if there's a presenter who has any kind of jitters, having like a sip of cold beer is a great way to just quiet that down.
Yeah, so my first time presenting a Data Grillen, I think, was 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, where a beer works really well. My second year presenting, I was on at 9 o'clock in the morning, and I do have to admit to having a bit of a hangover from the night before. And you get on stage, and I think I was talking about MDX or something, I can't remember specifically. Doing that with a hangover at 9 in the morning when you're being force-fed a beer is a whole other level of challenge to presenting. But it's interesting, actually, people's perception of that. I remember a session at SQL Bits many years ago where I think it was Thomas Kaiser did a Q&A session, a very informal session of basically sit down on a chair in the front of the stage and just answer questions about his knowledge of the underlying database engine in SQL Server was phenomenal. And he did it with a beer, and specifically did that to reduce the level of formality of the session, and wanted it to be an informal, like a fireside chat. And 99% of people loved it. It was a great format, really good conversation. But I think there were 3 people in the audience that really didn't like the informality of it, and were really quite put out by the fact that someone would actually come on stage with a beer. So you have to cater for lots of different perspectives at these conferences, and trying to strike a balance is never an easy thing.
I feel like you'll never have anybody that's going to be 100% pleased. We're fairly rarely to that. Like, I mean, like my last session, I went like 6 minutes over, and I got a 3 out of 10 rating from somebody because apparently I was being very inconsiderate of timing, as if like I was forcing them to stay for past the session time.
You can never please all the people all the time, but we can still try, can't we?
So to the topic of like the expanded universe of Fabric related to Power BI, where do we want to start the conversation on the journey of this?
I'm going to start out with there's 2 specific customers that we've helped out over the last couple of months or so, with extreme ends of the spectrum of how they've got their Power BI estate structured. One customer had in the region of 300 to 400 reports, so not a very big estate, quite small from got other customers with 8,000-9,000 reports in there. So this is quite a small estate, but every single report and dataset stroke semantic model, depending on old or new terminology, had its own separate workspace. And so they're managing permissions and security on a workspace level. So every report has its own set of security and management, and that became, obviously, if you look at powerbi.com, the portal, if you want to look at permissions, you can only look at it workspace by workspace by workspace. You can't look at the whole big picture. And so that one decision made it almost impossible for them to manage the governance of it. On the other end of the spectrum, so I spoke to a customer a few weeks ago that had, a similar number of reports, something like 500-600, I can't remember the details. Every single report and data set was in the same single workspace. They only had one workspace. Now that makes it really easy from a security perspective. You give someone access to the workspace, they can see everything. Now, that's easy from a management perspective, But with my data governance hat on, it scares the bejesus out of me, because you need to work on a least permissions required basis. And suddenly, if you have to give access to everybody to be able to see one report, and then they can see all the other reports, how do you even start managing and limiting the exposure of sensitive data in your organization? So somewhere in the middle, we need to look at, well, what is a workspace? What does it represent? How many reports should it contain? How do you want to define the security of it? And are you getting access to the workspace itself, or distribution via an app within the workspace? All sorts of questions that there's no single answer to. But the answer is not one workspace. The answer is not one workspace per report. It's somewhere in the middle. And really that comes down to the core aspect of security to me, of how do you manage security in Power BI? How do you manage exposure to reports? And not just reports now, when we start looking at bringing Fabric into things. If you give someone member access to a workspace, and you've got data warehouses, Spark notebooks, and lake houses inside the workspace, they get access to that data as well. So what level of access do you give to people, but what do you put in each workspace? And how do you manage that? And that's one of the most important conversations that we have with customers, is trying to get to the bottom of what that should look like in each organization. And some of it comes down to how much you can group together specific reporting types, the exposure of data. But most of it comes down to how does each organization manage their security from an Active Directory or Entra perspective with AD groups. How do they manage the security and permissions of these things? And tying those two together, you end up with a picture of what their workspace structure should look like. Once you get a handle on that, then I mean that leads on to 1,000 other questions, but that's really the starting point of it. Okay, well, what should a workspace contain in terms of dev, UAT, pre-prod, production, how do you test it, etc. Deployment pipelines are a real, very, very interesting feature now, where you can divide up your workload and say, okay, well, your dev team have got access to a dev workspace. They can promote into test. Your test team can promote into prod. Different access for different stages of that deployment pipeline. Now, that's fantastic. And it's not limited to 3 anymore. It used to be 3 different workspaces. You could have dev, test, and prod. Now you can have as many as you want. So one workspace now becomes 3 or 4 workspaces when you start including this deployment pipeline. And suddenly, this explosion of workspaces becomes quite significant. And then we start bringing in, well, okay, well, now we want to bring Fabric into it. Well, where do we put our data lake? Where do we put our warehouse? Where do we put our Spark notebooks? Do they go in the same workspaces? Should they go in different workspaces? And again, you've got the same challenge for there, is dev, test, pre-prod, and production. How do you manage that? And it becomes what once, prior to Fabric, it was a relatively complicated discussion with each customer to work out what that structure should look like. Now it's 10 times more complicated. And the challenge is there's no real best practices at the moment about what that should look like. It's very much on an implementation by implementation basis and a customer by customer basis, understanding how they want to work, how they want to develop, how they want to manage the deployment through the different stages of the dev process. And there's no single silver bullet or magic wand that's going to fix that for you. And that, I think, is what a lot of people are struggling with, is understanding how they want to lay out their Power BI structure, so they're not going to hit a major problem in a year or 2 years' time. Because there's one thing that's more difficult than planning a Power BI and Fabric architecture, is fixing it if it's wrong. Moving things around is somewhat of a challenge to manage the impact of that, and moving things around, and everyone gets upset because they haven't got access. So yeah, it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge, but that's really at the core of getting some comfort in what you've currently got in your estate and how you can prepare that to move forward in the future.
I've definitely seen a lot of companies that have gone towards consultancies early on to try to get advice, realizing it's too expensive, do it themselves, come back and then try to get advice again, and it's 2 to 3x the cost. And it's well, yeah, the environment has to be cleaned up now. And that takes it, dialing everything back and starting again takes a lot more time than starting from scratch. You basically have to knock down the house and rebuild it.
Yeah, and the impact of that from a reporting perspective is not insignificant. And one of the things we try and do is not just go into a customer and say, this is the solution. It's discuss why it's the right solution. Because obviously no estate is going to stay the same over time. It's going to evolve and expand. You're going to need new workspaces, new reports, new warehouses. So actually helping a customer understand how to think about the Power BI environments sets them up for success from the start, but allows them to govern it and manage it going forward. And that's quite critical. But again, as the functionality in Fabric evolves, so are the questions that need to be asked around how to manage it, how to structure it. And yeah, if you look at the pace at which Fabric is evolving with new functionality coming out, the amount of announcements last week that with new functionality that's in there, it's relentless, the pace, and I can't see that stopping. And every time new stuff comes out, for example, folders, when we mentioned just before we started the stream, it's only a small thing, but actually it's quite a big thing because that has a big impact on how you structure your workspaces. Because now a workspace isn't just one big bucket; it's a bucket with nicely structured folders that you can file things away in. Now, how useful is that from a security and management perspective? We don't really know yet because it's still too new. We're learning and evolving and trying to figure out.
I do hope that security will be able to be applied at the folder level, if they're going to add those in, but potentially, like I think, because without it, then obviously it's just a way to organize. But then the conversation wouldn't change then on what should be kept in one versus multiple workspaces, other than you could just have a few more things in a single workspace that can be navigated more easily. But I will be curious to know how they decide to do security around those, if any.
Yeah, time will tell with that. But at the moment, obviously, with security from a Power BI perspective, yeah, you can put security on a data set or a report, but largely it's a workspace centric thing, security. And with Fabric, you can allocate permissions to a warehouse or a lakehouse. But with things like row-level security, that's only in your data sets. But when one security comes in, that's going to apply row-level security on an individual file in one lake, which then applies all the way through the lakehouse or warehouse, through to the data sets, through to the reports. So security becomes, well, is it on a workspace? Is it on a folder? Is it on a warehouse? Is it one security on a particular file? It becomes quite a complex thing to manage. And that's, yeah, no easy feat. And if we look at the whole process of governing your Power BI and Fabric estates, there's three core stages within that. There's planning, there's monitoring and fixing. You've got to have that plan. You've got to figure out, what do you want your structure to look like? How are you going to manage your security permissions and structure and access? But then there's no good having a plan unless you have some way of effectively monitoring it to make sure that you're adhering to that plan, to find those gaps, to find the problems, to then come back and fix it. Now, whether that's for permissions, whether that's for monitoring the health, like data set refresh history or things like that, having some kind of disaster recovery plan for it, how do you make sure that plan is being kept to and not deviating away? Now, the best plan in the world is going to be useless if you let your environment run wild and people don't stick to that plan. And so that
actually one.
Sorry,
I was saying, like, for just along the lines of that, the one thing that of all the things that have been announced recently between FabricCon and everything, is the semantic link. I think is going to be one of my favorite things to actually help do some monitoring of a lot of the governance rule sets and other stuff, as you're mentioning, just holistically. Like, what are things that need to happen a certain way, and how can we be sure that they are, and if deviations from that plan starts to happen, or can we be alerted in any way? Because like we want everything to be automated at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a number of tools that are really going to help with that. Power BI and Fabric itself has very, very few tools that really allow you to monitor things effectively, largely because everything is workspace based. If you want to look at the the refresh history of a particular semantic model. You've got to go to that particular semantic model. Look at each one independently. It's not even workspace, it's on a data set level. Look at permissions, it's on a workspace level. Look at everything about Power BI and Fabric is filtered by that particular workspace. So you need external tools to help give you a bigger picture of the entire estate. Now, whether that's looking at data lineage of, okay, well, where is my data coming from in the organization and how is it exposed through to end users, of which you've got tools like Microsoft Purview, which doesn't just do Power BI, it covers everything in your estate. It's not a Power BI or a Fabric solution, it's an enterprise-wide solution, a very, very powerful tool. And you know, it's not the cheapest of tools. It takes a lot of time to get set up. Once it's set up, it's an incredibly powerful tool, and it can dig into things like, you know, searching all of your data for sensitive information, for social security number or email addresses or things, or bank account numbers, things like that, and tell you where the sensitive data is across your entire estate. Very, very powerful tool, but takes a lot of resources and time and money to get set up. We've then got Power BI Sentinel. Obviously, I'm slightly biased with that tool. It's focused purely on Power BI, and we're expanding it into Fabric capability now as well, where, you know, in half an hour, plug it in, set it up, and it will give you a complete end-to-end picture of data lineage throughout your whole Power BI estate. Even down to, if you've got a source database, a CRM, individual tables, views, and stored procs inside that database, where that's being exposed across your entire Power BI estate. One of the things the team are working on at the moment is expanding that to include Fabric capability in that lineage as well. So two different tools don't really compete with each other. They just offer very different perspectives as to who's in charge of that process. If it's the Power BI department, they're going to choose Sentinel because it's focused on Power BI and Fabric and gives you a much deeper dive in there. If you're looking at an enterprise-wide governance, you're probably going to choose Purview because that gives you a bigger picture of the entire environment.
Yep.
And then you've got, well, how else do you manage? You're looking at security. One of the key things, we were looking at with a customer last week of, okay, well, they've set up their security, everything's AD group managed and everything's set up correctly. But they went through a process of, they were spending a lot of money on pro licenses, and they also had premium licenses as well. So they wanted to do an exercise of, well, who could they remove pro licenses from to save a lot of money? But how do you go about trying to establish that? You need access to, I mean, so we went back over, I think, 9 months worth of audit logs that Power BI Sentinel captures and stores in their database to be able to work out who in the organization and what they've done over that last 9 months to really understand what license they need. If it's purely consumption, and if the workspaces they're consuming can be moved into a premium capacity, you can remove their pro license. Of those people that do have pro functionality, you can refine that list down and look at what they're doing. Do they need to be doing that? If they do, keep the license. And then use that to start planning which of the workspaces should be pro, should be premium, can be or even deleted. We had another customer recently who had in the region of 200 workspaces. We ran through analysis over a 6-month usage period and found that 90% of those workspaces had not been touched once in the last 6 months. Now, suddenly, from a data exposure perspective, from a why are you maintaining these things when you just don't need to? If no one's accessing them, get rid of them. So you probably don't want to get rid of them straight away, but certainly removing all the permissions and essentially disabling the workspace, leave it there for 3 months, and if no one complains, get rid of it. So going through this process of not just trying to structure your estate correctly, but how can you simplify it? How can you prune things that don't need to be there? Then massively reduces your workload in managing what's left. And if you can cut your estate by 90%, then when you start planning Fabric on top of that and planning development pipeline, deployment pipelines, etc., it actually becomes a much easier problem because you've got far less to manage and worry about. So it's the bigger picture of, it's the planning, it's the monitoring. How do you then feed that back into your estate to actually fix things? Now, part of fixing it is reducing permissions, reducing your data exposure in your organization, aligning your permissions with your actual activity. If someone's got permissions to a workspace they haven't used in a year, remove their permissions. They obviously don't need it. Reduce your security footprints to help with governance for ISO and SOC 2, etc. But then when you find issues, how do you go about fixing it? And there's a whole raft of other tools that can help with fixing the stuff. So starting out with, okay, Power BI Sentinel will take automated backups and change tracking of your data sets. Well, that in itself helps get to the point of understanding what's been changed. But how do you actually then roll back specific measures or Power Queries, etc.? Well, that's where Christian's ALM toolkit comes in. You can compare a Power BI PBIX file locally with your deployed semantic model in the cloud, and then selectively deploy or roll back individual calculations or Power Queries. Really, really powerful tool. There's a lot of tools out there that will help you with that. Another great one that's new since last time we spoke is the Git integration. In fact, it's new in the last 18 months, where you can now finally have an actual proper development process integrating Git DevOps.
That was a big game changer for sure.
And I like to think of a customer in terms of three different stages, three different groups of users. You've got your core central Power BI expert team, the people that really understand how to develop properly, that understand testing process and source control, and they want to do things properly because they're really providing the core central lakehouse, warehouse, certified data sets that really, I suppose, provide the core of your reporting environments. Now, they are the Git users. They are the people that really should be adopting Git to make sure they have all the tools at their disposal for change tracking, rollback, deployment management, etc. But you don't want to rely on them for all reporting in your organization. That's the old world of waterfall, centralized warehouse. No one gets a report unless it goes via the central warehouse. I want a new report. It's going to take 3 months to get that team to create it for me. Well, by that time, my reporting needs have changed. Doesn't work. So having that team for your central core functionality is vital to get a single central version of the truth. But then each department or workspace, individual project needs to have its own ability to take what central team have done and enhance, create their own departmental or project-based reporting. And we've now got things like a direct query over data sets or composite models within Power BI, where you can take the centralized data sets, inherit them, and add more data to them and enhance that model. Now that massively increases the power of your team or departmental based developers, because they can then tweak things without going back and rewriting the entire data set. You can massively reduce your duplication of logic. But those departments are going to be run by power users who understand Power BI, but don't really understand Git. They're not going to be using Git or deployment pipelines in the majority of cases. And then it goes one step further, where, okay, the finance team create their annotated and expanded version of the reports and data sets. But then Mary, your CFO, wants to integrate her spreadsheet with updated forecasts. Well, she can do the same thing. She can create another composite model on top that brings in her spreadsheet. Now, there is no way on earth she's going to want to learn how to use Git. So it's understanding who in the organization each of these tools is relevant to, and educating them appropriately to really get the most out of what they need to do, but not overburdening them with things like deployment pipelines, Git, and everything that they are really not going to care about. So then from a central management team perspective, that works great. But when that report that Mary's created breaks, and Mary happens to be off on vacation in the Maldives for 2 weeks, her deputy needs the report working, and they contact the central Power BI team saying, fix it. How are they going to fix it when they have no idea what that report does? It's giving that department the tools and ability to be able to understand who's changed something, who's broken it, what have they changed, what different versions have happened, and how do you then roll back and explain what's happened. And that's where third-party tools come in. The more you expose self-service, departmental, and power user developments, you can't just rely on Git and deployment pipelines. You need other tools like Power BI Sentinel to help manage that process and give you that centralized control, power, and ability to service your entire Power BI estate. And there's many tools around that will help with that, depending on the specific needs of what you want to be able to do and what control and power you want to give to that central team.
Well, even mentioning on the topic of composite modeling, that like I think a lot of admins know that they can turn that off at the tenant level, but not everybody I think is aware that you can turn that off at the model level inside of Tabular Editor, which is also quite useful. There's an option in there when you open that up for that specific model that just says composite modeling is not allowed, so people can't connect to it. So there's a feature configuration in there which can help at least localize that to certain models where you just know for performance reasons this is a model that already is at the bleeding edge of what it can do, and any layering on top of this is basically going to be torture for whatever's being ran against it. So you can disable it there.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on Tabular Editor there, which is another must-have third-party tool for really giving an extra weapon in your arsenal to be able to understand what's happening inside of Power BI. There's obviously that composite model enablement, but many other things. Functionality, once it's exposed in the model, it can take a while for Microsoft to go through their dev process to expose it in Power BI Desktop or in the portal. The Tabular Editor team jump in there very quickly, and more often than not, functionality is available in Tabular Editor way before you can access it in the Microsoft tools. So a really powerful tool to have. I would say don't give it to your power users, but certainly keep it for your Power BI experts and central team to help them resolve things. But you mentioned also about disabling composite models. Well, also by default, if you're a viewer in a workspace, you can't do that anyway. There's a specific permission against a semantic model called the build permission. When you add that, that gives people the ability to use a composite model on top. So again, not many people know about that. So they may come and try and use direct query over data sets or composite models, and they can't because of that build permission. If you've got, I think it's member, contributor, or admin in a workspace, then you can by default, but not viewer. Yep. So there's a few things like that, which again feed back into permissions. How do you govern permissions in your environment to manage that, to monitor who's got access to do what? And that is a constant recurring theme of what do you need to set? How do you plan it? Is it on a per user basis, or is it on an Active Directory or entry group basis? And then how do you manage it going forward and govern it to monitor to make sure you're not over permissioning? Is that a word, over permissioning? You know what I mean.
I think we can establish it as a word. It's the vernacular within the stream.
Which again layers more complexity at the top of the management side of it. What used to be a nice simple environment is growing in complexity more and more.
Exactly. And I think one of the big things, just to bring back to the topic of conversations on some of the management tools that you use for this, I think at a smaller scope, there's been some newer ones that are really good for like Git integration. One thing that I've appreciated that's helped to make Git less scary is like Power Ops, like desktop, or the service. It helps people just deploy to Git, but makes it not seem like Git, because Git's a nice thing for people who know what it is. And especially if you're doing multi-author development and you need really clean, strong lineage of object level changes in the report. And for those who might have missed it, I will say check out some of the new updates that I'll drop a link on in the chat on Rui's conversation. He's the product manager who created Tyndall, with Matthias Tierbach, the readable definition language for the model. And they just announced in preview the report definition language, it's going to be JSON, so it's not a new language, so it's more of a formatting layer, but it makes that a lot more readable. All of that is really good for teams that are intermediate to advanced and enterprise stuff, but It can be it's a huge jump for people who are going from version control in SharePoint, which still works as long as you're adding notes and checking in and checking out. But it's unfortunately not like just a step; it's a leap to go from that all the way into Git integration for remote. So any tool that can help, I think, alleviate that is nice to see coming out, or just the fact that it's built into the workspaces rather than having to use Azure pipelines and other stuff to do the deployments and syncs. It's just now built into the service. So I'm glad that at least that gap between beginner to intermediate is narrowing.
Absolutely, and it's a absolute kudos to Ruby and the team for what they've done, because it's a huge step forward, as you said. And for those core developers who understand and can really benefit the most from using that, it's a massive leap forward. But there's a tendency to think, okay, well, in that case, everyone in the organization has to use this, and that's where you fall down, because Git is not a straightforward concept to get your head around. Understanding, using it properly, and using it to benefit, not get in the way, can be a challenge, and business users, I think, are outside the scope of that. So it's understanding what the capability is, what it can do, what it can bring to your robustness, resilience, and DR aspects of your Power BI and Fabric estates, and then assessing who are the right people to use that, giving them access to it, at least as a starting point. Once they're familiar and are set up with it and using it, they can potentially expand and train other people in the organization. But start small, start with the core that are going to use it right. And don't expect everyone to use it from day one, because it's not right for everybody.
Exactly. And just because it exists doesn't mean it has to be used. It's the phrase is we focus so much time on figuring out if we can. We didn't ask ourselves if we should with some stuff. And I think that's a good conversation with honestly anything in Fabric, just in terms of what you should use, just from that perspective. So the just because it's available doesn't mean you have to use it or leverage it.
And all of this really boils down to the age-old challenge that we've had throughout our careers of where should data analytics be on the chart of governance versus self-service, centralization versus empowerment and distribution. On one side of the spectrum, you've got your old school data warehouse. It's controlled by the team, slow to move, very high levels of governance, very carefully curated, managed, and controlled, but slow to move. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum, you've got the self-service power users in Power BI. Let them run free, do what they want. No one monitors it, no one cares, no one controls anything. They get free reign. The old Excel hell world that I would say know and love, know and don't love, know and have been trying to get away from for many, many, many years. And if we're not careful, we're going to end up with Power BI hell, where you give Power BI to a user or a team and think, okay, well, now we've got a better tool to do our reporting because it's all server-based, it's all centralized. Well, no, they still have the same problems of they will run riot with creating thousands of Power BI reports that are unmaintained, failing to refresh, no documentation, no version control, nothing in there. How do you keep control of that? And where do you want to be as an organization on that spectrum? And there is no single point which is a right answer. There is this spread. I mentioned earlier about my ideal scenario is this 3-tier centralized data. If you look at the 80-20 rule, 80% of your reporting in your organization is going to come from 20% of your data. That 20% should be in that first block. That should be the core central governed, whether it's your stock levels, your actual sales, your P&L, etc. That should be the data that is heavily curated, slow to move, slow to change, because that core data shouldn't change very much. Then you look at the departmental, which is further down that path of it's less centralized, faster to move, but still requires agreement from within that department or that project of how a single definition of KPIs, a single definition of terminology, and you don't want someone to suddenly make a change without agreeing that everyone that's affected agrees to that change. And then you get the third layer, which is your power user, rogue user, XLHL user. Well, quite frankly, whatever they want to do is for their purposes only. They can do what they want. It's far less governed, much faster to iterate and evolve. The key thing then is to look at that big picture and say, well, if you've got a power user who's created a report that actually starts to be used by lots of people in the organization, starts to become business critical, it's no good them being, or that report being, a maverick self-service Power BI hell report in their own workspace. It should be brought back to either the departmental stage and managed within the department, or brought back further into the centralized departments, or at least the data source that comes from it should be brought into a data lake or something within internally a data flow that actually provides some level of centralization. And constantly monitoring data use in your organization, whether it's Power BI or Fabric, will help evolve over time. Let people go and develop their own things, but monitor it, because that becomes the proof of concept, the explorations, the rapid data discovery that the business needs to react quickly. But centrally, you have to keep an eye on that and rein it back in when it becomes business critical. Otherwise, someone changes that report, all hell breaks loose because it's broken. And as a central department, have you got the knowledge or the capability or the understanding of that report to be able to fix it? And that comes back into the monitoring and fixing. Fixing is not just fixing a problem, it's fixing the overall data lineage architecture of where in that three-tier it should be. And should that report or data set then be moved centrally and be included in Git and data deployment pipelines, etc., to minimize the potential of that causing a problem if it does go wrong. So it all ties in with itself, and it's as I say, not an easy one to define the correct structure, because it's a very fluid structure and it needs to be monitored and managed. And very few organizations have that structure in place yet. It's still very much a learning exercise for most organizations as to how they should manage it. And because a lot of these tools are so new, such as the Tyndall and Git, etc., that learning how to manage that in a company is a fun task.
There's a vision that I have just thinking about, like, because you've talked about a lot of layers, which I mean, thinking of like a Shrek analogy, like it's like an onion, there's at the very core is gonna central IT, and then you have the kind of the business layer that's probably doing the golden data shits, sharing them out to their teams, and then at the outer layer is the self-service. I hope someday we get something in Fabric which is enabling self-service, but it's not just a person clicking new report anymore. Like having something like new report from template, having like pre-packaged, because now with the PBIR format, I think there's going to be some big changes in the next couple of years with external companies, external tools, and other automated ways to spin up something, but pre-configured to keep consistency on either logic, making sure everybody's using the same type of calendar table, everybody puts their measures in a folder, they're using the same theme. But it would be really nice to start with a template and not a PBIT file, because nobody uses PBIT files, even though they should. And I try to encourage them, because you have to put that in a SharePoint folder, and then a self-service report creator has to remember to go to that. So I'd love, hopefully someday, because like Power BI right now, if you go to new, there's a whole section for new at the top, but there's a lot of white space there. So I would love to see like other buttons that show up to there, from like you publish to an artifact repository in Power BI, and then certified templates, starter kits for like a sales report template or this or that can all show up there, and you can create a self-service report, but it opens up with everything pre-configured that can be reused as an asset in a live connected report, or a thin report that's connected to like a golden semantic model.
The reporting dream.
Yeah, I know, right? Like that. I'm fingers crossed. I think it's gonna happen. We've had like just the fact that we even have a readable definition language now for reporting and preview, and leveraging that with some of the semantic link things that I've seen in notebooks. My eyes are very glossy over the potential of what this could become. But from a management perspective, it reduces the complexity too, because you end up with less of these goblin models and reports that people are throwing into their personal workspaces, which actually just bringing it to the fact of Sentinel, was my favorite, one of my favorite features years ago. And is that still something that really can only be seen by Sentinel? Like because there is no admin way to know how many reports really are being published in personal workspaces inside of the Power BI portal, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of there's a couple of things that we look at within Power BI Sentinel. One is the audit log of everything that's done, reports being created, deleted, shared, edited, downloaded, exported, connected via Excel, everything you can do with a dataset report, even Fabric functionality. And that includes personal workspaces. So you can, and this audit trail is stored in your database infinitely. So you can store as much history as you want. That includes personal workspaces. So you can start to see who is creating content and consuming the most content in personal workspaces, because that is a massive risk to a business. If someone's got business critical logic, reporting, and data inside their personal workspaces, and they leave and their account gets deleted, it's gone. There's no way of even an admin accessing it. So getting to that point early, understanding it's a problem, and then educating users to let's move things away into a shared workspace so that they can be centrally managed and a bit more DR going on, is absolutely critical. And one of the things we've introduced recently is looking at personal gateways. So obviously, when you need on-prem data, if it's been created centrally, then you'll use a standard enterprise gateway. Whereas when people just spin up their own personal gateways on their own laptops, well, if that personal gateway is being used to service business critical reports, and they go on vacation for a couple of weeks and turn their computer off, that report's not going to get refreshed. Now, there's no way of monitoring that inside Power BI. So we've got some clever logic that we've worked out on which reports in your estate are using personal gateways, and we infer a list of who owns those and where they are, so that, again, we can give you a list of which are the key ones to really look at from a risk perspective. So personal workspaces are still a challenge because they're very limited in the KPIs, what you can do with them. But because we extract so much of the API, we can find things that aren't immediately obvious and do a little logic to infer things and give you that information, which can be quite useful. But just taking one step back as to what you're talking about reporting Nirvana, about being able to create whatever report you want. Question back to you: is that Copilot? Is that the future of Copilot, to be able to give it a simple sentence of "I want a report that does this," and will it just go away and create you the world's perfect report?
There's still way too much layering, I think, for that and subjectivity, because it's the age-old manager rock scenario. I want a rock. Okay, here's a rock. Well, not that rock. Well, what rock do you want? I don't really know. Like there's a lot of interpretation and I think subjective expertise that needs to come in from a developer, and also like understanding some layering in terms of conditional formatting and all these little things that go into, like, you can make a good starter report for sure, but like I'd say an enterprise level quality production report with the right amount of like configurations, pop-ups, links, and drill throughs and all that other stuff, with proper filtering with a complex model, that I still think that would be a long ways away. But like I would love to be able to tell me the last 10 reports in my tenant that were the most used, and give me a distribution on what hours of day and who was using them the most, and just have it give you a little quick statistic and a chart from like a monitoring level. I think that would be amazing, and that probably is something that eventually I could scrape the API for. But reporting, basic reports, yes. True, like high quality CEO level reports, I don't think that it's going to do that in the near future.
Yeah, I completely agree. So just on that scenario, if you had Power BI Sentinel installed and you had our Power BI report on top of your Sentinel database, you could ask Copilot that, and all the information is absolutely there, and it would give you all that information out of that. So where you've got a semantic model that already has access to that data, that is well named, well structured, has row level security, whatever else in there that you need, and if Copilot's got access to that, then yes, it will give you the answers, and it will give you the answers very, very quickly. How accurate is it? I think is reliant on how well you've structured that data set. For example, is it certified or promoted? Does it know it should be using that data set as opposed to 20 other data sets that are called usage analytics. So the structure of it, which workspaces it can trust, which data sets it can trust, and how well they've been structured is critical for Copilot to be able to then extract that information. But you're absolutely right. It will never, well, never. In the short term, it's never going to be able to get to a point where it's going to create you a perfectly polished report. But I'm not sure if that's the real need. I think where you've got a report that's going to be used by 1,000 people every day or every Monday morning, your weekly sales reports, that's going to be really specific on how you want to present the information, and that's where your developers need to focus on. To me, where Copilot is the CXO level or the senior manager level, where you don't want a beautiful report to be reused for the next 3 years. You want a single question. You want to say, okay, well, which is my highest selling product last month? And you want it to give you an answer. You don't care about how pretty the answer is. You just want an answer so you can take it to a board meeting in 5 minutes' time. And getting that answer quickly is critical. And I think it will absolutely serve that purpose of giving you that quick answer. The challenge for me, which I think you alluded to, is can you trust that answer? So if I ask it a question, how many customers do I have? Well, in a retail environment, what does that mean? What is a customer? Is it a customer that's asked for a catalogue but has never purchased something? Is it someone that's actually purchased something? Well, what about those customers that sent it back and got a refund? Are they a customer? From a sales perspective, from a finance perspective, they may count as a customer. But from an actual product perspective, well, no, they've not bought anything. They don't own the product now, so they're not a customer. So you ask 5 different people in the organization what a customer means, and you're going to get 5 different answers. So the danger to me with Copilot and any automation tool, any AI tool, is how does it understand what you mean by a customer? And that's where defining the data sets, the data dictionary of terminology comes in. Do you define that as a marketing customer, an accounting customer, or a sales customer, or an orders customer? They're logically different calculations. And how do you educate all of the users in your organization? Because obviously if you're in the marketing department, they're not going to say how many marketing customers do I have? They just want customers. To them, that's the only calculation that matters. So how does Copilot learn that and understand that? It doesn't matter whether a data set is certified or promoted or how well the data set's modeled and named. That ambiguity is always going to be a challenge. And that, I think, is going to be one of the biggest issues of if a customer comes to us and says, okay, how many customers do I have? I ask them the question of what customer do you want? If they ask Copilot, it'll give them an answer. And if they're trusting that answer without thinking they have to question it and understand the logic behind it, that's very dangerous. So I think,
and that's the difference between AI and AGI. AGI, which could be 10, 20 years away, whatever it is that actually would ask questions and follow-ups for clarification where, as you said, this one doesn't. There's no discovery really that this does, unless you ask it to ask you questions. If you tell it you need to ask me follow-ups, then it will, but it's not going to do that on, by default. It's just going to give you the, well, whatever you ask for, I will give you exactly that, and then end of conversation. Yeah.
And that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges why we're doing a lot of work with Copilot, a lot of experimentation, a lot of proof of concepts with customers, but I'm a little reluctant to advise customers to really take the brakes off and expose it across the organization until we understand that, until we really understand the implications of expanding it. I think it's phenomenal technology, and it will. The pace of expansion and change is just incredible. Where it was, where large language models were a year ago to where they are now, and the integration into the Office suite and Power BI, etc., is staggering. Where they're going to be in another year's time, we can only guess, but it's going to be much more impressive. But are they going to be able to tackle those challenges? Time will tell. But certainly have that in the back of your mind when you're thinking about adoption of any AI tool. I was doing a talk at an event about a month ago about AI and Copilot and the evolution of large language models. So I took everyone back to the start, looking at expert systems and talked about Pac-Man. So I thought, well, I'll set myself a challenge of every slide in the deck has to be created by Copilot or DALL-E or ChatGPT, I think 3.5 I was using at the time. And so it started out with Copilot. create me a slide with a picture of Pac-Man on it. And it was utterly laughable. It created this big yellow blob with this massive smiley face with big googly eyes. I mean, it was nothing like Pac-Man whatsoever. And it was delighted with this. It gave me a whole spiel of, I've created you the perfect Pac-Man, this, that, and the other. Silly example, but you can't necessarily inherently trust the answer it's giving you. You need to have that level of questioning.
And I will say
And
just one anecdote from Sam Altman at OpenAI. He's admitted that ChatGPT 4 has actually gotten bad. It's kind of gone out of control a bit. And they actually have to they've had to put a lot more limiters to I forget the term, but whatever the rules are to keep it within a certain box of like thinking framework. They've had to put more and more and more of those on because it's had weirder and weirder hallucinations and stuff. So it's but unfortunately you can't kind of just hit the reset button and delete and like get rid of the whole thing because it's continuously self-improving. And so he has openly stated that in like an interview recently that there's some problems with ChatGPT 4. So it went from really good to like its answers are either it just won't answer it or they've gotten worse until they eventually release the 5th version of this. So another reason that this is a very infant thing. But digressions aside, I know we're getting close to time, and I wanted to give you an opportunity maybe to if you wanted to show an example or two of Sentinel, I can flip over just as something to show what we've discussed a little bit as a monitoring tool.
Yeah, sure, no problem at all. I'll get my screen shared and we can have a, let me know when that's coming through. Okay, so within Power BI Sentinel, we extract a huge amount of information from the APIs and the logs of what's going on inside Power BI and export that back into your own database, which you can query however you want. But we also provide a couple of Power BI templates, PBITs that you were talking about earlier. We use them for this. And you can enhance these and play with them to do whatever you want. It's really about giving you access to the information. There's two things I'll jump on this, just to show you kind of how simple it can be to get access to large volumes of information. The first one is permissions. If I want to see what a particular user has access to in Power BI, I would need to go to every single workspace, looking at the permissions individually and build up a picture and probably exporting into Excel and managing it all manually. But if we go into Power BI Sentinel reports, I can list all my workspaces, all my users, and I can choose a particular user. Let's look at Joe Green and see across all of the workspaces in my estate what permissions that user's got against that workspace. Now, we've actually just made an enhancement to this, which is not yet available for download. It will be over the next couple of weeks, where we integrate this with your Entra Active Directory group membership. So we actually add another column in the middle here that says, okay, well, Joe Green has got access to the particular workspace. Well, is it allocated directly within that workspace to this user, or has he got permissions via being a member of an Active Directory or Entra group? So it gives you that full picture of permissions across the entire estate, whether it's workspace, app, datasets, or reports. And that really helps you manage understanding the exposure of data. If we combine this with data lineage, I'll just quickly show you, not one of the prettiest screens, but shows you the concept of, I want to see where data is coming from and to. So I want to look at all SQL Server databases. So I can see all my servers here. I'm going to choose a particular
That's really
server.
nice to be able to do that, yeah.
And I can see here that's using 2 different gateways. These are all the databases. So I want to choose this particular AdventureWorks database. And I can see here all of the workspaces data sets that are pulling data from that particular database. Now, if I've got Power BI Premium or Fabric or Embedded, I can then see all of the functions, views, and stored procs inside that database. So I want to do a PII assessment on customer data. I can choose customer and see all of the data sets and reports across all of my workspaces in the estate that use that particular table or view inside that database. Now, when you combine that with the security, I can now see, well, this particular database or this particular table, which data sets and workspaces is it exposed, and therefore, what are all my permissions of everyone that has access to that particular data? We can then combine that with the usage logs of looking at the usage logs to see, if I want to look at the audit log, who has potentially viewed content from a particular workspace, view report, for example. And so you can look at this audit log of who's created, deleted, exported, connected to see who is actually consuming that content. If we jump back to this, one last thing I want to quickly show is the refresh history. There's one thing worse than not having data available in a report to your business, and that's having invalid or the wrong data. People think they're getting the correct data, but they're not. So this report shows all of the data sets that have had a refresh or a data set refresh failure over the last few months across the entire estate, no matter who's viewing them. And we can look at that and see, well, why did it fail? The actual error message. So do you have duplicate data? But actually here, yes, it failed, but it was fixed the following day, so everything's okay. Have you got data sets that are failing multiple days and never being fixed? So here, for example, that report has failed for 2 days running and no one's fixed it. So as a central governance tool, you can then reach out to individual owners. You can look at the audit log to see who created or last changed the data sets and reach out to get people to fix it. So you can improve the health of your overall estate very, very quickly. And one of the challenges is managing your estate when you get to a few hundred or thousand reports. It's easy to tell someone to fix something if you know who to tell to go fix. How do you know what's broken? How do you know what needs fixing? And Sentinel gives you that visibility of data lineage, data set refresh, backups, endorsements, things like that, of what needs correcting. I'll give you an example of that. If you want to do an analysis of do we have row level security across our data, well, I can filter the endorsements to, for example, our dim customer table in a warehouse. And this gives us across our entire estate, every workspace, every data set. We've only got one that has row level security, and that's not the promoted data set. So doing an exercise of how do people get our customer data, how is it exposed and where is it, this will give you that action list of how do I go about improving the visibility, exposure, and security of that data, or integrating the data lineage through to configuration and usage and permissions to have that overall holistic view of everything. And that's really the purpose of the tool, is not to solve your problems. It gives you easy access to the information so you can ask it whatever question you want. And because all this is in your Azure SQL DB or Fabric Data Warehouse, you can write SQL queries, you can write Spark notebooks over it and get the information you want, depending on what challenges you want to solve in your organization. Or you can do the simple option and use our PBIT Power BI report templates that you can see now.
I mean, so I'm aware that you could pop this right into like metrics as well and turn on flags and notifications of certain statuses if a value was to change, anything in here.
Absolutely, yeah. Hook it into all the great work that Will Thompson and his team are doing with metric alerts. Yeah, with the data activator to actually then use this to generate alerts of this is a problem. Raise something in a Teams site, or send an email or send a message to say this needs looking at. So it's really about providing the information easily without spending years trying to decipher the rather challenging APIs that come with Power BI and Fabric. So exactly. Yeah. So hopefully that gives you a very quick overview of the kind of capability. Obviously, there's far more that it can do. If anyone wants a demo of it, drop me an email to help@powerbisentinel.com, and me or one of the team will happily give you a demo, walk you through the functionality, and answer any questions you've got. It's a tool designed to help people manage Power BI, and so if you've got a particular challenge, we want to hear about it so we can enhance the tool further.
My favorite comment is from Mark. You're very smooth, and that was a very silky demo.
I've done it a few times. In fact, if anyone's in New York next week, we're exhibiting at the Data Universe conference in New York on Wednesday and Thursday. So if anyone wants to come and have a chat and have a closer look, then come and say hello.
And there is one question actually from Fernando that I realized I missed. I wanted to pop up. So communication is a critical factor. So developers know where to find a specific table or semantic model to use, or link instead of creating a new one. Would this be correct?
Yeah, exactly. One of the things you really want to avoid is data duplication. Of you've got the same data, the same forecast or budget data being in 20 different data sets, semantic models. Sorry, still can't get used to the terminology change. Because then you want to change the logic, you've got to change it in 20 places. How do you manage that? Well, the starting point of it is to say, okay, well, of all of the 20 data sets that I've already got, which one should be promoted or better certified to be the single gold standard? So when people want to come and build their own report of it, they see this is the certified data set. They know that one flag tells them this is the one you should use. This is the one that should be trusted. So that's the first step. That's quite easy to do. Then you get the challenge of, well, okay, well, how do you actually remove those other 19 data sets that are duplicating that data? The data lineage will help you with that, because if you find a particular source of data, it will tell you where that's exposed across your entire estate. You can then look at the owner of it or look at the audit log to see who is managing it, editing it, viewing it, to really ask those questions of, should this be here? Can you get the same information from the certified data set? Can we remove this one? Or if that report or data set has got data or capability that the certified one doesn't, update the certified one. Let's merge the two together and start shrinking that pool to shrink the number of data sets so that everyone has a single view of what's going on. Now, in some cases, you may genuinely need multiple copies of it. That's where naming things correctly comes in. That's where having security. Well, if your marketing team want forecasts, they should have access to the data in the marketing workspaces, not the finance workspaces, because finance have a different view of it. They want to see forecasts against their metrics and their data. So understanding the naming of the workspaces and the data set is critical to help with that, combined with the certifications. But also, and one of the things I didn't show you in Sentinel is you can actually add comments and descriptions against data sets, workspaces, even tables, calculations, etc. So if people want documentation as to the purpose as to why something is there, you can use that as a centralized data dictionary to really help people understand what they should be using something for. And then monitoring usage of, okay, who is connecting Excel to that data set? Should they be doing that? That again comes back to the monitoring of the audit logs of, are people doing things appropriately or inappropriately? How do you, and it's not a question of blocking it, it's about education. How do you help these people, these users, understand the better source that's going to give them faster, better, more accurate, certified data to help them get confidence in the data? And once you build confidence in your Power BI platform, then it will keep growing. But confidence is about getting the right data, be able to find it, trusting that it's up to date and accurate and maintained and curated, and confidence that will always be available, not suddenly failing to refresh or permissions suddenly get deleted or whatever. So that building confidence in the whole platform is really what we're talking about. This whole session is the planning, the managing, the monitoring, the maintenance, and the fixing to build confidence that as your estate grows, people can use it more and more and more without having to come to the central team every time they have a question, which makes our lives easier.
It does, and as you said, a lot of it is confidence in the service and in education, not a blocking. Like you don't want to limit people. You want to guide them to the right access. You know, if they're doing something wrong, what's the cause of that? Is it through they don't know the right resource to go to, or they don't realize a certain data set semantic model exists? So there, it's two halves of the coin to a degree for that, making sure that you've created the things that need to be created, but also then that there's an awareness of where they are through promotion, certification, or just a center of excellence that can help people get an overview of what's just available on the platform.
Absolutely, and that awareness and identifying where there's a gap in that and having a process to fix that and educate is critical. And that loop is quite challenging just with Power BI out of the box. But a lot of that comes down to what process you want to put in your organization to get that state that you want to get to. And every organization is different. Don't let anybody tell you there's only one way to do it. The right way to do it is what empowers you to deliver accurate, trustworthy reporting to your users and empower them to do whatever you want to empower them to do. Whatever facilitates that is the right solution in your environment. And every environment, I don't think I've ever seen two Power BI environments that are the same, because no two businesses are the same. So ask yourself the question, what do you want to be able to structure? What do you want to be able to provide in terms of confidence, governance, support, maintenance, management, etc.? And that should drive the conversation of security, permission, structure, capability, etc. And once you start asking those questions, it starts to become a little clearer what you need to do to achieve that.
The wool is pulled up from over the eyes, essentially, at that point.
And it can be a scary view.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Once you're exposed to it, it can be scary because it's not easy. But make a start. The later you leave it, the worse it'll be. The earlier you start, the earlier you can actually get some control over it, and the easier things will be going forward.
So we've talked about a lot of things. If we were to boil it down into like a few key takeaways that you would recommend people tuning in now or listening later to go home with or take away from this, what would you recommend as some of those highlighted recommendations?
I think one of the key ones is we just covered it. Build trust. What do you need to do to build trust in your environment? Now that's trust in terms of data consistency, availability, transparency, and regulatory in a lot of environments. Have that as your key top list of things you need to address, that you can go back to your board or stakeholders and say, yes, this is the goal for my plan. I need to build trust, consistency, availability, transparency, and regulatory compliance. Once you've got that, everything becomes easy. Now, how do you do that is more tricky. So then we look at, well, okay, the management of workspaces. Go back to square one. Look at what to you defines a workspace. How do you decide whether a new report or data set should go into an existing workspace or a new one? That definition, whether it be project-based, departmental-based, security-based, etc., is your choice. Determine that, and don't let everybody create workspaces. They should be created through a central team that understands and can manage that to avoid that data explosion. Then once you have that, go back to that 3-tier architecture or 3-layer that we talked about. What is centralized, heavily governed, and slow to change? What is departmental or project-based, and what is self-service? Once you get all of those concepts in your mind, you can start to pigeonhole certain things, features, reports, and aspects into those, and it becomes a little bit, I say a little bit clearer. It doesn't become clearer because there's a huge amount of work to do, but at least it helps you start to categorize whether something is right or wrong and where it should go. So those are my top 3 things to keep in mind. And actually, I'll add a 4th, which is the plan, monitor, fix. You can't monitor it and fix it unless you've got a plan. No point having a plan unless you monitor it. No point monitoring it unless you fix it. All 3 have to be there in order to get a good, solid, complete environment. And I'm not saying you are going to have a complete 100% perfect capability across all of those, but working towards that is key. And once you have that, you've got a perfect Power BI environment, then bring on Fabric, everything's easy from then on.
Establish the the artifacts and roles that need to be in your core IT, your business unit, your self-service, and then you have your plan, monitor, fix. Everything comes in a set of 3, you know?
Always.
And then you have your bronze, and you have your bronze, silver, and gold.
There you go.
Yep. And throw in the platinum that people have liked to, like, oh, then you have the platinum layer, the double diamond layer.
Well, again, you ask 10 different people what should be in your bronze, silver, gold, and diamond, and you get 10 different answers. It's
exactly.
It's always touted as the perfect framework to where we need to be with data engineering. There's so much more depth and complexity to it than that. You can
also just have 2 layers too. I mean, like some companies are small enough you don't you can have a gold layer and you're fine, or maybe just a gold and silver, or gold, silver, and bronze, or you can have the 4th or the 5th. It's
And this is the challenge with reading books and watching presentations, is that people say this is how you should do it, and I absolutely agree with you. There is no single right answer. Every environment needs to be assessed on what does it need. Don't overcomplicate it. Sometimes you need to, sometimes you don't. No matter whether you're talking about Power BI, Fabric, warehousing, Synapse, Like, do you need Synapse dedicated SQL pool, or do you just need an Azure SQL DB? Keep it simple. A lot of cases, simplicity is absolutely key. Unfortunately, a lot of consultancies make their money by making things overcomplicated because that drives up the dev time and drives up their billable hours. But ultimately, you end up with a solution that's overcomplicated, difficult to manage, and ends up being self-defeating. So really do question, do you need, like deployment pipelines? They're a fantastic feature, but you don't always need them. Don't overcomplicate it unless you need to. Question everything.
Get integration. You don't need it, but it is very useful for certain companies. But it is overcomplicated for a business of 10 people that has 3 reports.
Yeah, yeah. It's each individual's job to ask the questions as to the relevance of things and make your own decision. Is it right for what you need to achieve? But if you go back to that starting point of trust, consistency, availability, transparency, and regulatory, and where that's 5, not 3 things, sorry. Where do your requirements, where does something fit into one of those? If it doesn't fit into one of those, do you need it? What's the business justification for putting in a more complex process and solution if you're not getting return on that investment? Because anything like that requires more time, requires training, requires management, requires monitoring. What's the benefit if you're not getting the return on it? Now, that return is down to your organization, your department, your business need. And that's, yeah, different people will have different perspectives on what that return needs to be. But a centralized Power BI department essentially has to report to many different stakeholders in the business, try and collate those together into one pool, look at what the actual goal is for that environment, and that will drive how much you need to adopt these things.
Exactly. The like the last takeaway I'll just say is be aware of diminishing returns. Good is the enemy. No, perfect is the enemy of good in a lot of those. And as you said, yeah, simple. Like so, the KISS methodology, keep it simple, stupid. It applies to everything. So this, simpler the better for most things.
Very much so. Very much so.
Mark's commenting that everybody needs Git. Well, enterprise clients, yes. Otherwise, I'd say everybody needs to get some type of version control. I will finish the sentence to say any kind of version control is the most important part. But otherwise, Alex, I want to appreciate you coming on for this and for the conversational aspect of it. It's good to be able to have a chat and just have a discussion on topics like this and provide some insights and anecdotes from case studies and clients that you've worked with. So I think it's very insightful to help pass some of that information on and a bit of the gotchas back to the people watching.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. Always a pleasure to talk to you, and great to great to be part of this. So thank you very much for the invitation.
Absolutely, and as mentioned in the chat, if you're curious about the tool that Alex built and showed, Power BI Sentinel, it's in the description of the YouTube video below, also in the YouTube comments, and it's one of the few tools that I essentially recommend to anybody who's has a department of about 25 or larger people that needs to actually monitor their tenant and has more than a single workspace. It is very, very useful for pretty much all organizations. So it's one of the few tools up there with DAX Studio, Tableau Editor, and I think maybe Bravo that it's worth the price just to pay and deploy for your company. You will save a lot of headache versus trying to write your own report off of the API.
Well, very much appreciate that. Thank you. And again, if anyone wants to talk in more detail about it, get a demo, etc., or just talk about particular use cases, then always happy to talk to understand what you need and whether we can help.
Absolutely. And then with that, I wish you a good weekend, and everyone, I'll see you online next week.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Cheers.